It seems like people can't quit talking about quiet quitting. In this episode, we suggest why the phrase should phase out in favor of more robust conversations around performance management. We will also address a listener's question about standing out in the remote workplace. Join the conversation by following us on Twitter at GuildmasterC, checking out our blog at www.guildmasterconsulting.com/blog, or subscribing to and commenting on our YouTube channel. Simply search Guildmaster Consulting in quotes and you will find us. Welcome to Somehow We Manage, the podcast for software engineers and their managers. I'm Dr. Ashley Graham.
And I'm John Graham.
And we are Guildmaster Consulting. So this month we wanted to talk about something that's been in the headlines. I'm sure you've heard of it and you may be exhausted of thinking about it, but the phrase quiet quitting, sound familiar? Yeah. So we want to talk about that because we had some listeners inquiring about our thoughts on that topic, and also a kind of related topic of performance management in the remote workspace. I mean, how do you not just fly under the radar in the quiet quitting scenario, but how do you get noticed when you don't get to, show off in the traditional ways that you might in office? So John, I wanted to get your thoughts first because I saw you reading this related article and you were getting super frustrated with it. And I was like, okay, save it for the podcast because I'll hear your rant then. What's kind of on your mind as you think of the phrase quiet quitting?
First, when I was beginning to understand what quiet quitting was, it looked to me a lot like what you would say in the 70s. If you worked in a union, you would call it working to rule.
Okay.
And
Now, I've not heard that phrase before. You'd think I would, but working to rule?
Working to rule was basically striking in an industry where it either wasn't possible or it was illegal to strike. Mm-hmm. Working to rule basically meant you fulfill exactly what's in your work contract, nothing more, and follow every single step of the safety measures and everything else that might be in your standard operating procedures. It not only slowed output, but it also made it very apparent how important expertise and labor is. You can't just replicate this with a pile of books and a contract. There's a lot of know-how that labor has, and they can pull that out at any time.
That kind of goes back to our education podcast earlier of like learning organizations. The difference between knowing something and knowing how to do something also reminds me of like the theological distinction between going by the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. Like, I am following my contract exactly how it's written, but I'm not doing this because you didn't explicitly state it.
And it's interesting, this is a form of direct action from labor, historically. Mm-hmm. This is a form of, okay, we're not happy with our contract, we're going to work to rule and to give the union bosses leverage to get a new contract. Mm-hmm. Now today, we're calling it quiet quitting, probably because up until this year, nobody's in a union anymore.
Right.
You're seeing a lot of unions pop up, and I think that's part and parcel with the huge shift we've seen from the power of capital to the power of labor that's been happening across the industry. Mm-hmm. Now, we are management consultants. That doesn't necessarily mean we take a certain side in that, but in advising managers, it's really important, I think, that we look at this with both eyes open and understand, okay, there's not as much leverage anymore. Let's still try to accomplish the goals we had while recognizing that labor has more power.
Right. But you sounded pretty frustrated, like audibly frustrated when you were reading something earlier. I just hear you scoffing in the corners. I'd love to know what's your point of frustration, because I don't imagine it's with the unions and that impulse of work to rule.
My frustration was in finding out that some people are using it as work to rule, but most people appear to be using it as just what we would call work-life balance. Like,
quiet quitting is just preserving your humanity.
Quiet quitting means turning your laptop off at 5. Oh. Quiet quitting means doing what's expected of you and no more. And that's normal. And you can
it was at some point.
It was at some point in time. You can kind of see the pendulum in that slingshot that I mentioned earlier of capital and labor. You can see why it's heading back so quickly, that what used to be considered normal is now abnormal, and we're expected to be on all the time, responding all the time, and so on. And it's frustrating that we're having to come up with a name for this movement of like normal 40-hour work week, which, Henry Ford discovered. It's
And the unions advocated for. Right?
And so it's frustrating that simply putting up boundaries is an act of defiance. And it just goes to show you just how much movement is still left in the reestablishment of the relationship between capital and labor. And we need to, as management consultants, we need to keep being prepared for labor to keep pushing, because they do have the upper hand. We can talk about, oh, we're in a recession. You could almost see certain folks salivating in Inc. magazine or Fortune magazine about, like, finally a recession to reestablish the natural pecking order. And yet this recession is at 3.5% unemployment. And of course, we mostly work in tech, where unemployment has historically, except for the dot-com bubble, been below that, even during recession. Finding talent has always been incredibly hard in tech, and we can't just adopt these very haughty, brash tactics, and we've known that for a while. We've known for a while that you can't have dress codes in tech, that you probably don't want to enforce working hours too much because people just leave and go find somewhere else.
Oh, you were saying that, part of our role is helping managers prepare for this change in labor versus capital. Do you want to say a little bit more about that preparation?
It's the same stuff we've said in other podcasts. The remote revolution's here to stay. You don't want to pay attention to what Goldman Sachs is doing. People are passing around these articles saying, oh, they're forcing a return to the office. And first of all, they're ignoring the fine print where they had to increase salaries by 20% to prevent turnover from going crazy. Your competition is not Goldman Sachs. Your competition is a company that's just being founded right now.
Yeah.
The new entrants are where tech labor has traditionally always wanted to go, because that's where the exciting projects are. How many new entrants are starting with offices? Very few.
Yeah, right. Doesn't behoove them.
It's a huge competitive advantage to just start up. You don't need an office anymore. And that's where you want to pay attention to where the culture's going. And remote is here to stay, especially in tech. And the more we look clear-eyed at that, the less you'll get frustrated that, to be honest, I would want a manager that is frustrated that labor's so entitled to, kind of get an attitude adjustment themselves. We're here to make money. We're here to make profit. It doesn't matter who's entitled to what. And frankly, management's been entitled pretty lately. That we can all just force people into bullpens, and now we're watching whether or not they wiggle their mouths. This is dumb. This is not profitable. This is not focused on creating value for the shareholders, for management, for the employee, for the consumer. This isn't focused on that. It's focused on basically reinforcing a power structure that was perceived to be there before. And meanwhile, a bunch of startups are not really interested in enforcing power structures yet, so they're not going to do it.
Right.
And if a lot of your talent wants to go there, that's what they're going to do.
So you've talked a little bit about quiet quitting and how it's being used and how it's being misused to kind of hide the fact that we should have boundaries and work-life balance. Like, it's shifting the conversation from request or an expectation of a worker to have that balance into, oh, well, you're just barely making it. You're trying to signal your exit. I'm interested in people who, on the flip side, want to be noticed, right? How do they get noticed in these remote workspaces? Because so many people are traditionally used to, like, oh, if I'm working there late and I'm coming in early, then that shows that I'm committed to the company. And, like, we don't want to incentivize that kind of commitment, right? So, like, I don't know. I think I'd love to talk a little bit more about how to get noticed. Before I do, if you like what you're hearing and you want to hear more from us on this topic and many others, we start alluding to things that we have in other podcasts, hit that subscribe button. And also join us in the conversation on Twitter and in our blog as well. We'd love to have your comments there. On YouTube, if that's your thing, you can simply search Guildmaster Consulting in quotes and you'll find us. Okay, back to your thoughts here.
So your question is how to get ahead in a remote workplace.
How to get ahead in a remote workplace without, like, going into the trap of, I can't have work-life balance, right?
Yeah.
Navigating that line.
I think I want to take a step back and look at this relationship, because we're actually talking about the same thing. How to get ahead, and then this quiet quitting, and how do you performance manage in a remote workplace. Let's take a step back in history. How do you performance manage in a non-remote workplace? Everybody's coming in the office. Well, ideally, you're setting goals, measurable goals that ultimately are tied to financial goals in a sustainable way, and you are checking on those goals and you're seeing if you achieve them. And if you don't achieve them, you are trying to figure out why And if it's a performance issue, you're giving feedback. If it's a repeated performance issue, perhaps you're looking at dismissal. You're looking at training the whole time because human capital is part of your strategy. Does that all make sense?
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything left out. That makes sense to me. Like your traditional KPIs or OKRs or whatever you want to call them, management by objective. And then also the training to support. Anything else I'm thinking, like, it seems like the bulk of performance management and managing expectations.
So here's the big question. Why is everybody suddenly frustrated at performance management when we went remote?
Right.
I didn't see a single thing about being local. And the fact is, and I'm going to shake you up a little bit,
Okay.
most places, management has just been Bush League this whole time.
Oh, no.
They are not doing what they were supposed to be doing. They were instead relying on seat checks and reputation. And that's not how you find performance.
Right.
And what's happening
It's
is...
liable to, I mean, you're going to set yourself up for failure if you do have to terminate someone or promote someone, if that's your, like, gauge, right, for performance management. Okay.
So you're in the majors now, where basically talent is far more scarce. The world is different. It's a more competitive environment. And what's happening is people are realizing that they never really did have it down. They were just lucky and it was easy. And now it's not so easy. So
Who's they, the labor or the managers?
Managers.
Okay.
And so every part of their form, their batting form or whatever, is weak. And they just got by because they were a big fish in a small pond before. And now that things are a little more equal, they've got to do what they were supposed to do in the first place. So how do you performance manage in a remote workplace? The same as you performance manage in a local workplace. It's just you never did that. And now you're realizing why it's important.
Okay. Easy to say. If I'm hearing that as a software engineer, I'm like, well, there's not truly a disconnect between being present and getting my KPIs, hitting my goals and metrics. Like sometimes these goals are predicated often on effort, right? Instead of value.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of hard to even shift that. Even if you say, okay, I'm going to try and do performance management, and we've always done KPIs or OKRs, but like reevaluating those OKRs to not just be about effort and presence, that seems to be a hard thing. I know we talked a little bit about that last time, but how would you instruct managers or even direct reports who are trying to get this across to their managers, this return to the basic?
This is why this is actually, it's the same question and answer as how do I get noticed? How do I get ahead here? Because I want to get back to that relationship between capital and labor. A lot of people are on Wall Street bets nowadays. A lot of people understand a little bit of crypto. That probably you should not be trading options. Please do not trade options. However, many people know more about options than they used to. Management and capital is buying a call from labor. What does that mean? That means management and capital get to keep all the upside, the profit, for a fixed cost to labor, the salary. And what has been happening is they do that. They seem to believe that the only way to actually extract any profit is to just exploit labor. When management's supposed to be bringing to the table a couple of things. They need to be thinking about opportunities. They need to be thinking about vision setting. Like, you need to see something. You need to be opportunistic. You need to see something not being provided in the market. You need to be able to envision something that will provide that thing. And you need to be thinking in terms of, how do I get from where I am to where I want to be? How do I pursue that vision? All these things are strategy. That is what capital brings to the table. In addition to the tooling and the money, management, well, if you found me on any other podcast, I will tell you very explicitly, management and capital are two very different classes of people. Right now, they're on the same side of the negotiating table, so I want to kind of lump them.
Okay.
Management brings strategy together. The whole upside of that capital-labor relationship is supposed to be provided by management, not labor. They're the ones supposed to be spotting the opportunities and thinking of good tactical ways to get there. Labor's just a vendor. Labor's just providing a thing that management's supposed to be putting together in some clear strategy. Instead of doing their job, management often thinks its job is to exploit labor and to just get more stuff. But the problem is, because you don't have a strategy, you don't know what to do with the stuff once you have it.
Right.
Management is about setting priorities.
Yeah, that's what
strategy is priorities. If you don't know what you need, you just want somebody to work longer, How are you solving your problem? How are you generating that value? How are you generating that value that the capitalist is supposed to take as profit? You're not doing your job.
Yeah. I mean, it goes back to the Mythical Man Month in some ways, like throwing more effort at something, throwing more people at a problem when you haven't even decided what the most valuable dimension of the problem space is.
Yeah, we'll get more lines of code.
Yay.
Good job. Is that what we needed?
Yeah.
We needed value to the client, value to the consumer. And if we're just making everybody work as long as possible, and this isn't necessarily just some manager with horns and a whip trying to get everybody to stay as long as possible. It's also treating labor as capital, as a form of exploitation. When you have options that pay out if you hit a certain, profit number, and you expect your developers who don't have those options to be working just as hard as you by saying, "Oh, we need passion. We need,
I hate that.
You should want this." No,
Sorry.
That's not part of their deal. That's not part of the financial
That's not in the
arrangement.
contract.
That's not in the contract. They're getting zero upside most of the time. And before people weigh in, it's like, actually, my developers have options. Are they voting options? Are they voting stock? No. No one gives that out. So you're actually just finding a way to hide salary on the balance sheet when you do that. Yeah. You're giving them some financial upside, but this isn't like an equal relationship. Let's stop treating it like one. If labor wanted to be capital, they could go start their own business.
I mean, that's interesting because when I hear this dichotomy, I can read you generously and hear you generously, but it's like most of my career is like as a direct report, right? So I'm thinking like, well, I want to help set the vision, or I have ideas. I'm not just a workhorse, right? But what you're saying is, no. You can have vision and input and ideas and be a thought leader as an individual contributor. However, when it comes to like the prioritization, like surely that needs to be centralized in some way, or like someone at the end of the day has to make a call. Ideally, those decisions are protecting you from having to enforce work-life balance boundaries. Ideally, those priorities are aligned such that you're not spending hours on something that doesn't matter to the company. Because if you think back to a time in your career where you worked long hours, I don't know if you have, John, you're super good at boundaries. But when I think back, it was often because it was unclear to me in my role what was the most important and most valuable work. And so it was just toil, right?
But they got more and more and more and more, and they didn't have to make that decision.
Yeah, they didn't have to make a call. They didn't, what? But
because
okay.
they relied on your passion.
Yeah, but like, okay, so that's worst case scenario. They relied on my passion or other people's passion. Best case scenario, it's just hard. It's hard to make those decisions, I guess. Maybe because the C-level, the executive suite, isn't making those decisions. And so, it doesn't trickle through the organization and middle management and so forth. It's got to be hard.
It's sure it is hard, but so is, coding.
Yeah.
So is event planning.
Yeah.
So is all this labor.
Everything that requires decisions.
And you just made a fool out of me from the beginning of the podcast. I said I wouldn't go here, but we have now entered the triangle table negotiating. Mm-hmm. Management is a form of labor. On many sides, we confuse the manager for the capitalist. The capitalist provided the funds. The manager provides the strategy in the organization, and then all other kinds of labor provide specialized skills. When you remember management is a form of labor, your job is to develop strategies and priorities for the capitalist. They don't know what they're doing. That's why they hired you. The correct way to financially reason is through diversified portfolios. I'm just putting money in pockets that are exposed to certain risks. And then from there, those pockets get assigned to managers who know about that industry and that company and everything else to do something with it. And when we don't make decisions and instead just rely on passionate employees to constantly cover our asses of like, I didn't decide what you should do, I'm glad you did it all, and then decide afterward, going and separating the wheat from the chaff, like that's just lazy management. We're here to help you get better.
Right.
We're here to help you become a good and effective manager. But we have tons of people in the audience who either were in an individual specialist role or as a manager who, it's a management chain, who's just like, why is this so hard? And it's like, I get it. I get that it's hard. We're here to help, but people have to want help. And before they can want help, they have to know that they're not
There's a
good at
problem.
what they're doing.
Yeah, for sure. Sure. Okay, so I know you weren't going to go into this triangle, but I'm curious about it because it makes me think of what happens with bad management, or like when the capital thinks it's also the management and also the labor. Like, I'm thinking of times in early startups, or honestly even bigger companies, where the C-level or founder is like, oh, I know what to do with engineering. I'm going to make a call and we don't need this programming language anymore. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
It just makes me realize how when that collapses, you're doomed a little bit. Like, because then labor just becomes a workhorse for the whims of someone trying to wear all the hats.
And everyone's doing one.
And how do you even do performance management and something like that? It's like, you advance if you do something the way that I would do it, but I'm not going to tell you that that's what I want. Like,
Well, that's maybe what it looks like, but really you advance to the extent that you've made me look good, and I don't know what's going to make me look good because I'm not savvy enough to
setting
know
priorities and strategy.
Well, I'm
and
not
vision.
thinking about that, and it's a big scary problem to me. It is difficult because it's, startups are like the black hole of capitalism, like everyone's everything. And to an extent, you might have a tech-savvy founder still making good calls
Sure.
when the group's
Yeah,
small.
good intuitions.
You just need to know when you've grown beyond that. And I want to kind of hammer this point. You not knowing what you want and just relying on hoping that you have passionate employees that generate too much is worse for you too. And it's worse for the shareholders. It's worse for everyone. Labor's getting exploited, management's not doing their job, and capital's getting a, subpar return. Because that's just not a good way.
Generating waste.
You're generating a ton of waste. So I don't want anybody to hear this and think, oh, these namby-pamby pro-labor people. We're not pro-labor. We're not anti-labor. We're just trying to solve the management conundrum. Management is a huge negotiation between multiple parties, the people with the money, the people with the know-how, and the people with the need. And the manager's in the middle, basically trying to broker some sort of peace between that. By just trying to take advantage of one and setting them against the other, you have shrunk the pie. Anybody who knows something about negotiation is you try to get that pie as big as possible before you start slicing it up. And by just automatically assuming that one side's going to get the short end of the stick, you've shrunk that pie. So let's get back to what you should do as a good manager. You should be thinking about setting goals. You should be having a vision. A strategy is tactics that work better together, all trying to strive for a shared goal. That goal is often what we call a vision. Those tactics are often like just kind of decisions that you've made, decisions with trade-offs. That's management. So you're trying to generate value out of putting together clever decisions and having good goals where you've spotted good opportunities. You're not necessarily just trying to drive people to work as hard as possible because you don't know. They're just generating lines of code rather than solutions for a client. Now, once you have all that, it's really easy to hold people accountable to those goals. And you don't need to be watching their seat all day and seeing how many pull requests they make. That's not value, that's pollution. That's the external visible parts of doing work that we have confused with generating value for the client or the consumer. Instead, just get better at measuring that value for the client and consumer. When we give hiring advice, believe it or not, the reason we can give good resume advice and good interview advice and everything else is because we're telling future employees the same thing as we're telling management when they ask, how do I interview? We're saying it is in both of your interests to find these key things. You want cultural fit, and you need some sort of skill level. And here's how to best find those things. And then we're telling employees looking for jobs, find a company where you're going to fit culturally and prove your skills. It's in everyone's interest to figure that problem out. It's very similar here that it is in management's interest to think of a strategy and from that set goal. And it's also in employees' interest who want to get ahead, who want to make a difference, who want to, get noticed and get promoted. Find those concrete goals from your manager and achieve those things. And if you can't nail down your manager, then you've at least discovered early.
Yes.
That you're in a place where you're probably not going to get ahead. That you're either in a place where reputation management matters, and maybe that's not aligned with your, your cultural values. It's not really our target market. So if you're listening to this, it probably doesn't appeal to you. Or you may not be in a place where the company culture sets concrete goals, but maybe you have a good manager that does that. By negotiating with your manager and coming up with what are the goals, what do I need to do to get promoted or noticed, what do I need to do, and I'll do it. By having those conversations, you are also kind of exercising a part of influence, Robert Cialdini's book, Consistency and Commitment.
Tell me more about that.
You're basically asking, hey, let's put something down on paper, and then when you achieve those things, you should be able to expect.
There's an expectation.
There's an expectation, and there's this drive from the person who wrote them down and was like, oh yeah, I did promise you that.
Yeah.
So that's commitment and consistency. Now you're either going to get somebody who reneges on their commitment. Again, you've discovered something very valuable. You're probably not going to get ahead there, or that's how you get ahead. Goals work for both sides of this table. Setting goals gets you what you want rather than just trying to get as much output as possible. Get somebody in their seat as long as possible and hope that you can make something with the rubble. And then fulfilling goals is a great way to get noticed. I don't know that you want a promotion though. I'm going to try and talk people out of a promotion. We talked earlier about Capital has bought a call from labor. So labor's whole point here is they don't get an upside, but they get a stable salary. They get to take home cash right now. Play that game is what I would suggest. Look for goals, clear-cut goals in the job descriptions of places that might hire you.
Yes.
Now, to the extent that you get promoted at a place, that's great. But don't build your career hoping for handouts from people who are themselves too busy thinking about their own
How do they
career.
get ahead? Yeah.
Instead, look for concrete measurable goals that you can achieve and blow people away at. And if you can't get ahead, then get it on your resume. And always be looking for what are you selling as labor? You're selling a skill set for a price. Always be looking to get a higher price from somebody else, and where you are demonstrating your skills more and more. So don't rely on promotions, rely on the marketplace is what I would say. There's good reason that you can expect raises, and this last year with inflation, raises were all over the place. Yeah. But a lot of people expect, 5% is a good raise. Yet if you up and quit and go work somewhere else, you'll get 10 to 20%, possibly a title change. Yeah. So pursue training. Yeah. Keep your ear to the ground on new opportunities in the marketplace. Sell your labor like labor. It's
or like a product. Like some of what you're talking about, like the way you're talking about goals is the way that I think product managers talk about requirements or user stories, or the way an engineer talks about exit conditions or like definition of done, right? It's
like exactly.
I need to know that when I've met these functional requirements, of the job functions in this case, that I have pleased the end user, I've pleased the client.
Yeah, I
my
fulfilled
manager
my part of the contract.
Right, exactly. So kind of a generous reading of contracts. I know Agile doesn't love contracts, but you know what I mean. Like a contract as an interaction, a relationship that you're building that's negotiating who's getting what value and how do I know? How can I point to it? And like you said, if you can't get the promotion, if you're still following this advice of back to the basics of goals, like making concrete goals with your manager or with your direct report, you're developing for your resume. Yeah. You're keeping those concrete bullet points. Yeah. So, and that's what's hard too, is I know places that don't do title changes. They're like, I'll just pay you more. You don't need a title change. It's because they can keep you there because you don't have something different to put on your resume. You priced out for your title. So it's like always be thinking about, as a direct report, and as a manager, what you're going to have to show for yourself. Yeah. And it's not about showing up at the office. It's showing up in meeting those goals. Yeah. Anything else you wanted to talk about before we wrap up here? For those of you who listen to us, you know that we have to do things in the span of our baby sleeping. Actually, she's 1 today, not a baby anymore, but I hear her talking. So anything else before we wrap up?
No, I just want people to know that we're on a mission to try and get better managers out there. If you are unhappy with your manager, or if you're a manager unhappy with your manager, or if you're a manager looking to get better.
If you're just unhappy.
Help us out. If you're watching this on YouTube, give us a like and subscribe. We'd love to hear in the comments, how are you dealing with remote and performance manager, either as an individual contributor trying to get ahead or as a manager trying to see who's doing what. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple, feel free to email us at hi@guildmasterconsulting.com. We'd love to hear from you on those same questions. How are people dealing with this?
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks.